Crucifixion was an ugly process.
Crucifixion was the most horrible form of torturing and killing that the Romans had been able to devise, and they were pretty good at that kind of stuff. It meant right across the Roman world, we Romans run this show, and anyone who gets in our way gets rubbed out, and rubbed out horribly.
What's the charge? Well, the official charge, of course, is that he's a political rebel against Rome.
Treason.
It is, exactly.
So Jesus was executed not for blasphemy, as the Gospels indicate, but as a political revolutionary, a threat to the established political and social order.
If we don't understand why he could be executed, then we miss the political passion that animated his mission. In a sense, he gave his life for the least of these. And when we turn the story of Jesus instead into the eternal sacrifice for sin that makes our forgiveness possible, then we really set aside that which mattered so much to him, namely the poor, the untouchables, the suffering of people in the world.
"2,000 years later, Christian pilgrims still come to Jerusalem on Easter and commemorate the day that Jesus was led through the streets to the place of his execution, carrying his own cross."
What killed Jesus is the same dynamic that has been responsible for the martyrdom of Martin Luther King, of Gandhi.
What Jesus was opposing was the normal discrimination, injustice of normal human life. Jesus, if we're willing to face it, if he was among us today saying the same sorts of things and doing the same sorts of things, he would not be executed, but he would probably be assassinated.
The Gospels say that Jesus hung on the cross for a few hours before dying. We assume of suffocation, since the idea behind crucifixion was that your lungs collapse under the weight of the hanging body. The Gospel stories don't end with Jesus' death. They say that afterward, Jesus is taken down off the cross. His mother and a few others bury him in a rock tomb. Most of his closest followers had fled. 3 days later, according to the Gospels, the women come to the tomb and find it empty. Jesus then begins appearing to his friends, and suddenly they come out of hiding, proclaiming that he is risen from the dead, resurrected. We asked so many people what they thought about resurrection. There's a wide range of opinion.
The first question is even more basic. Was Jesus buried at all? Roman crucifixion, the purpose of crucifixion was state terrorism, and the function was to leave the body on the cross for the carrion crows and the prowling dogs. It was not simply that made you suffer a lot, it meant that you didn't get buried. That's what made it one of the supreme Roman penalties, lack of burial. As I read those stories, I feel terribly sympathetic for the followers of Jesus, because I hear hope there, not history.
Some scholars think the resurrection stories were borrowed from Eastern pagan cults popular throughout the Roman world at the time, called mystery religions.
The conviction was in the mysteries that there is death and resurrection, just as crops go into the ground and die and come back again for a new season in a wonderful kind of way. So also in human life, we go through a kind of death and resurrection.
Now hold it. You're saying that the mystery cults had an influence on the Jesus story because people who wrote the Jesus story took an earlier story and passed it on via Jesus?
I believe so. One of the greatest difficulties that early Christians had if they were going to cope with the reality of the crucifixion of Jesus is, what do you do with that? I mean, how do you keep the movement going? How do you have some hope in the face of this kind of shameful and horrible death? And one of the things I believe that early Christians did is they took the model of the mystery religions. They took that story and retold that story as the story of Jesus.
But the mystery religions and their gods lost all credibility centuries ago. Not so with the resurrection of Jesus. His followers stuck to their story, even though they were persecuted. And as we know, the Jesus movement grew and flourished, which is why some eminent scholars believe there was indeed a resurrection.
I simply cannot explain why Christianity began without it. I've already said there were many other messianic or would-be messianic movements around in the first century. Routinely, they ended with the violent death of the founder. After that, what happens? The followers either all get killed as well, or if there are any of them left, they have a choice. They either quit the revolution, or they find themselves another Messiah. We have examples of people doing both. If Jesus had died and stayed dead, they would either have given up the movement, or they would have found another Messiah. Something extraordinary happened which convinced them that Jesus was the Messiah.
And over 300 years after Jesus' execution, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. 2,000 years later, Christians from all over the world venerate the place in Jerusalem where it is said Jesus rose from his tomb.
I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know as an historian that they must have seen something.
And even the most skeptical of scholars and historians agree on this. In his brief life, Jesus of Nazareth probably met and spoke with no more than a few thousand people. He wrote nothing. He commanded no great army. And he spent most of his time with the poor and the outcast. But he had a vision for a just world which was so vivid and which moved him so powerfully that he was willing to die for it. And after his death, his vision somehow transformed the world. Miraculous.